What is actually going on with Palworld? Has Palworld really fallen off? Palworld made waves when it first came out, with record-breaking Steam player counts, and it was basically all anyone was talking about. Simply about making a game Pokemon fans actually wanted, with an alive, feeling world and interesting new gameplay. That wasn't just a reskin of the same game for the past... One sec. 28 years, jeez. This game was also made by an incredibly small yet robust team, including, but not limited to, a convenience store worker, a high school graduate, as well as many more, and what they managed to create was wonderful, only being beat by PUBG with 3 million players. All this makes it undeniable that Palworld has had a major impact on the gaming space. Constant arguments between coping Pokemon fans and Palworld fans, as well as helping spark the debate of why AAA can't keep up with the quality of these smaller devs like Larian and Arrowhead Games, who've made these absolute bangers with way less resources. But as with all things, time waits for no one, and a month after release, Palworld has lost around 80% of its player base, and the hungry ass Pokemon fans are trying to move in for the kill. But why? What happened to Palworld to cause such a sudden fall? Well, it's a variety of factors, and definitely not what most people are going to think at a glance. But before we address anything, we really need to talk about what kind of game Palworld is, in order for you to properly understand why people are leaving. Palworld is a game where you catch Pokemon and level them up in battles, obviously. But that's also a very small part of the overall gameplay. At its core, it's an open world survival game with crafting bases, etc. And Pokemon are just sort of lumped in there as like an attractive bonus. But unlike other survival games, it's surprisingly linear when it gets down to the core progression of Palworld. Starting off in the game, you have next to nothing, and you can level up from doing things like building, killing or capturing pals, as well as opening chests around the map. Something else you'll find relatively fast is these green idols. Selecting these and offering them to the statue will increase your capture rates for pals, and they can be found around the map in set spots. After this, and maybe catching a few pals along your way, you're going to want to create a base of operations in order to maximize the slavery stats, to help acquire resources and just level up. You see, one of the main parts of Palworld is trying to upgrade your tech tree to unlock stuff like equipment for pals, such as the Panda Grenade Launcher or the Napalm Fox. Guns, because it's a funny Pokemon game with guns. Remember when that was how this was marketed? Yeah, me too. Oh, and the slavery part. Can't forget that. Regardless, using these tech points, you create better equipment, upgrade your base, as well as allowing you to challenge more challenging pals like the world bosses or the dungeons that can be found around the world. These guys will drop you rare crafting materials and ancient tech points needed to upgrade, as well as just being beefier than your average pal. And this is where the open world of Palworld comes into play. Like Elden Ring, a lot of the fun of Palworld is exploring the areas and discovering new things like bosses placed in certain locations around the map. Just like this penguin guy who always clips through the wall and soft locks the fight. Love that guy. Or the dungeons that have ore veins, loot, more bosses, and evil magical orbs. Another thing is, after a while playing, your base will get raided by either humans or a group of pals. Oh my goodness, hubba. These are my wives, by the way. I am not crazy. Another thing you could do is play in servers with other people, but this really didn't do much in my experience. I would occasionally see someone passing by, then stare at them as they went along their way, subtly hinting in game chat that I would murder them in a set amount of days. Now, as you can tell from all this, the game is pretty big. I would hazard a guess at it being about 100 hours of content to fully complete the game. But if that's true, then why are people starting to drop off from such a rich, wonderful, deep experience? Well, it's because there's one core problem with Palworld. It's all curated. Nothing is randomized. All pals have set biomes they spawn in, as you can see from the habitats page. All bosses spawn in the same areas. Recipes are always unlocked at the same level. And for the most part, you're mostly only going to fight certain bosses at certain points because of the level system. Who's actually going to go fight Jet Dragon at level 1? No one. He's just going to nuke you from orbit like Pyrocynical's fanbase talking about his haircut. Like I said, it's surprisingly linear. And once you reach max level in Palworld, have captured everything you want, and set up an optimal farm, there's really nothing much left to do other than min-max stats for pals with breeding, which is cool and all, but there's not anything in the game to warrant you needing to min-max so hard, so you'll probably just quit the moment you get a good farm and strong team. Plus, the way Palworld's combat works is much less turn-based combat like in Pokemon, but it's more you and your pal just jump whatever the hell it is you're attacking. This means, unlike the end game of Pokemon, there isn't really a quote-unquote comp scene available. It's a lot more messy, so creating builds is a lot less deep, and since the game has the same layout every run, it will get incredibly repetitive. positive, which whilst that may not be a bad thing, it is when the core principle of the game was exploration and discovery, and the allure of that is definitely lost on repeat playthroughs, because you're just going to beeline straight to the best areas, make bases where ore deposits are, and capture the best pals wherever they spawn, because you have that knowledge now, the forbidden Palworld knowledge. And this I believe is the key reason why Palworld is quote unquote falling off. It's not a lack of content, but more so a lack of endgame. People on Twitter are saying it's bigoted and you should instead support the small indie dev game studio called Game Freak, but they really have no impact on the game or its state at all. They're just in a constant state of coping because mainline Pokemon games have had one difference in gameplay in, nearly 3 decades. Another thing that supposedly led to Palworld's downfall was the claim that assets and art were AI generated, but from what I've seen there's no conclusive evidence of that. And now that we understand why the gameplay is unable to retain the game's monumentous numbers, let's face it, 2 million players at a time is unsustainable, especially since the game isn't a free-to-play. I want you to switch phones right now. Player counts were bound to fall regardless of the game's quality, and when people get their money's worth, they tend to stop playing. This loss of player count isn't an indicator of the game's quality at all. It's just that unlike every other modern game, it doesn't have constant updates or as much replay value as we're used to. That people were going to look for any weakness it had and say the game was falling off, despite the fact it's still boasting very, very healthy player counts. Now you may think that's it, right? Palworld had its 5 minutes of fame, and now it's going to trail off slowly over time until it fully dies. Well, guess what? No. Take a look at this. That's right, the devs are doubling down. They announced they're going to work on new content. That means new pals to be captured and abused, new areas to be explored, and finally raids, just like my old Stockholm Syndrome game. The devs have made it incredibly clear they want to keep supporting Palworld, meaning that despite this drop-off, people are going to come back when those juicy, voluptuous new pals come to the game, as well as those new areas and raids, because it will add the end game Palworld needs desperately. They also have been constantly pumping out bug fixes for the game, and it's many, many bugs. Let me put it like this, just because Helldivers 2 came out and is now the center of attention, that does not significantly subtract from Palworld, just like how Palworld didn't kill Lethal Company by replacing it in the cultural zeitgeist. As you can see, Lethal Company still gets amazing player counts, especially considering its size and the amount of updates it gets, and Palworld is definitely going to be a similar case. Maybe a little worse off because it's nowhere near as replayable as Lethal. Bear in mind, Lethal has been accused of the exact same thing as Palworld. Everyone accuses it of being dead when really it's just a natural decline as people get their money's worth from the game and move on. I mean, Lethal hasn't had an update in 2 months and it still pulls in impressive player counts, right? Same thing's going to happen with Palworld. It'll likely be a few months before we get new content, but even then, Palworld will survive. I myself got a solid 25 hours out of the game before I had to stop playing it to make these godforsaken videos. But you could easily get more out of it, and I probably will keep playing in my downtime. The hate this thing gets is just overall kind of pointless, and probably coming from people that haven't played the game. And don't get me wrong, Palworld isn't like a masterpiece of an open world like Elden Ring, although they do share a few faults. But with everything we've talked about, it's pretty obvious as to why this game is declining, and that it's in no way fallen off. It's basically just a single player game that had multiplayer slapped on. If you want things that are fallen off, I can show you things that have really fallen off. Anyway, in conclusion, the pals need the slavery, they want the slavery.